I want to talk about monuments a little bit. There are some monuments that are troubling, right? Some of the Confederate monuments are troubling. Maybe they all are. I also find Christopher Columbus stuff troubling. And the reason I find Christopher Columbus stuff troubling is that Christopher Columbus is not a real thing. Okay. There was a guy, his name was Cristobal Colon, and we can talk about what he did and didn't do. He sure as hell didn't discover a pair of continents with 50 to 100 million people living on them. That's not possible.
Well, maybe
right?
they didn't know.
I mean, that's like that's like me discovering light bulbs or something. But in any case, Cristobal Colon discovered.
Sorry.
Cristobal Colon discovered the Americas on behalf of Europeans, and that is, of course, a good thing, I guess, if you're European, and it's a disaster if you happen to be descended from one of the 50 to 100 million people who were living here already. So the point is, look, those people are Americans too, or at least many of them are. They are entitled for us not to do national myth-making around a figure that was a complete disaster, right? National myth-making has to include all of us. History is complex, but national myth-making really should be about all of us. Discovered America doesn't make any sense. So I'm not a fan of Christopher Columbus or mythologizing about him. But I was looking at some of this stuff about Mount Rushmore, and I was ready to have my same eye-rolling reaction. Like, I'm pissed off that they're pulling down statues of George Washington. Yes, I know that he held slaves. I know that he was a flawed person. I also know that he was a decent person, and that the fact that he held slaves doesn't say otherwise, which is tragic. It should, but it doesn't. Now, what I learned in studying about George Washington, and I don't put this up against the slaveholding, but I do say this was a complicated character. He actually defended Jews in the colonies. I didn't even know there were Jews in the colonies.
Yeah, I didn't
right?
either.
Right. So he was a defender of Jews in the colonies. That's an unusual fact about the man. He was also unusually decent when it came to power. George Washington could have been king if he wanted to. People were in the mindset that they needed a king, and they would have made him king gladly, and he refused it multiple times. So this was a complex man, and we have to deal with him in his full complexity. But you know what? They're all complex. Martin Luther King Jr., there's strong evidence of plagiarism, right? He was also, I don't want to use the word philanderer, but he cheated on his wife. Mm-hmm. Not an uncomplicated character, but obviously, if we're going to limit the conversation only to people who have nothing weird in their history, it's going to be a very quiet conversation, right? Your heroes, by the very definition of the term, are going to be people who've traveled unusual paths, and those unusual paths are not going to be rosy all the way. So we have to tolerate the fact that history is a complex narrative, and we have to deal with the complexity. So,
well, the dehumanization works both ways, I think, and by both ways, maybe it won't be clear what I mean just yet. We see people dehumanizing their enemies and imagine that they are just pure evil, and that if they have a view that seems out of step with what is currently acceptable, then they must also be, Nazis, basically, right? But there's also a dehumanization that happens in the other, like, valence, in which, and maybe the most famous version of this, that, like, the archetypal version of this, is the noble savage, right? We have this idea that whoever existed in advance of the colonial forces coming in, for instance, was living a true and virtuous life on the land, in which they would never have used up all the resources, because somehow the tragedy of the commons and all of game theory and the competitive part of evolution and the fact that tribes were meeting tribes, populations were coming up against populations, and resources were scarce, somehow none of that applied. There's this dehumanization that imagines that some people lived a perfect utopia, and one also that imagines that some people are pure evil. And really, the first one is just not possible, right? As much as we've talked about in a number of places, maybe mostly in the book that is still not out, about the Mayan Enlightenment, right? The extraordinary number of things that the Maya, long before the European Enlightenment happened in Europe, discovered. They had astronomers, they had scribes, they had the concept of zero, they had agriculture, they had obviously architecture, they had the written word, and they had libraries full of books. And their understanding of their universe was extraordinary and rich and deep and varied. And also, throughout the Americas, there was slavery. This is before Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, ever showed up. There was slavery, and there was war, and there was murder, and there was rape, and there was all of these things, because every time you get humans together, these things will end up happening. And, maybe we are at a moment now, finally, where we are seriously reducing slavery and genocide, but they're not over. They're not over. Rape, they're not.
Right.
And imagining that there was any time in the past, any population that was stable that didn't have at least many of these things is delusional.
It is delusional. Now, I do think, this is a deep conversation for another time, I do think there was something different about what was going on in the Americas than in the old world at the point that Cristobal Colon showed up. And I think it was different because the Americas had not yet become full. In other words, people become more brutal as the zero-sum dynamic set in. And so I do think that there is, ironically, something about the native populations that in the same way that our prosperous nation has been capable of doing very good things because it was prosperous, because we weren't resource stressed, I do think that there was something to be gleaned from what the native populations were up to, and that even the slavery, when you look at it, it looks less brutal, a lot less brutal. And so anyway, that's a conversation for another time.
Well, just to tag it, it's a zero sum versus non-zero sum, and what kind of frontier were they engaging in question. Right?
Exactly. But actually, this brings us to this marvelous example. So I was looking at this, series of articles about monuments being torn down, and I was looking at, the New York Times waded into the thing with Mount Rushmore, and I was just not feeling good about where we were headed. And I ran into an article in which a Lakota chief was saying that we need to tear down Mount Rushmore and that he would do it with his own hands, right? And I was not in a mood to entertain this argument. But I read the article and I was disturbed because although I do not for a second think that we should tear down Mount Rushmore, I was quite compelled by his argument. His argument was very robust. And so I don't think it really is an argument for tearing down Mount Rushmore, but I think the point is actually there is a reckoning to be had over Mount Rushmore, right? If ever there was a place where there was a need for an understanding that the land was stolen and then repurposed for a patriotic demonstration that negates a particular population's history, and that in fact a current demonstration of American patriotism that includes fireworks is actually putting the land in jeopardy, right? The land being flammable and these fireworks being not in keeping with good stewardship. I was compelled that actually this was a very strong argument, and that in fact what I would like to see is us having that. In other words, we do need to be involved in a negotiation over the correct way to go forward from the history of this monument. Now, there was also, the New York Times was all about telling us that the sculptor was a white supremacist, which I don't know if he was a white supremacist, but he clearly had ties to white supremacists. He was also an anti-Semite, and I thought, you know what? Okay, I have standing in this conversation. He was an anti-Semite. That does not for 1 second make me want to tear down this monument, right? So, we're in a complex landscape, but it is one in which there is another way that involves honestly reckoning with the past and figuring out how to bring everybody in on that reckoning. And the final thing I will say is that our good friend Dave, the sword maker who made the knife behind us, pointed me towards an article in which there is a statue in Alaska of Captain Cook. And the question came up, of course, as it would in this era, what to do about the legacy of Captain Cook and his compromised moral standing. And the solution was to unfortunately, I don't have the article here, but basically the village, in Alaska it's villages, not tribes, the village that is most prominently affected by the legacy of Captain Cook, that is to say, the people who suffered the most as a result of Captain Cook, were brought into a discussion about what to do with the monument, which seems to me exactly the right thing. It's the honorable thing, and it's the thing that will allow us to move forward as Americans together, rather than some of us tearing down monuments that mean things to other people, which is only going to result in us becoming foreigners to each other and allowing the world to collapse.
That seems an interesting approach. I hadn't heard it. It obviously wouldn't work in most cases. Certainly in the lower 48, in general, it's much less clear what who the most affected are by particular historical figures. In Alaska with Captain Cook, it's an easier thing to pinpoint. I'm still a little bit concerned about the sort of populist solution making there, but in that case, I see a place for it, at least in the approaches that might honorably be taken. Next question. I think a current problem is using current morality for past choices. Absolutely. Couple that with conflating those past choices with current morality and pulling it into the present is very harmful. Basically, I don't think we should have a societal book of grudges. Happy 4th. Yeah. Now, and this is when you were talking about monuments. I agreed with everything you said, but I also just thought, well, I cannot believe we're here. Like, why does this require any discussion at all? Haven't we been over this one many, many times in exactly this form? The idea of erasing history as a response to, as if these kids, mostly, right, are suddenly recognizing that atrocities happened. Like, okay. As we know this, atrocities happened. That doesn't mean that the response is to tear down the people who were adjacent to them or who did them.
Well, all right. Now I'm going to push back a little bit.
Okay.
Some monuments are despicable and need to come down in some way, right? So you remember the Nazi eagle that famously was blown up and destroyed on film after the war.
Yep.
That eagle can't stay.
Yeah.
Right. And there are also statues of.
But hold on, I'm going to interrupt you. It was blown down then by the people who were conquering Nazi Germany and getting rid of the threat to the world.
Right. And they're toppling statues now.
But they were responding. That was history was being made in Nazi Germany.
Yes, history is being made now.
They are responding to something that happened 100, 200, 300 years ago. My point is that the Nazi eagle that was destroyed, and I'm not saying that all monuments need to stand, obviously, but when was it the Americans who destroyed the Nazi eagle, I think, right? They marched in to a regime that was actively proclaiming that thing as virtuous. Right. And in the moment, like that was side by side in time and space. And this is side by side in space, but not in time. There is a remove.
Right. But that remove means very little to me, right? My point is that these people believe this is the moment at which they are confronting such a regime. Now, they are wrong. They are making up history in order to justify this. But the problem is okay, but when are you and when aren't you? That's the question. So they are doing something. And my guess is, if we looked at all of the things that they are confronting, that there are actually statues which are deliberately a finger in the eye, right? And that those statues are a problem. And the problem is that just like they are going to tear down people, and this week, okay, we've arrived at Steven Pinker.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
Steven Pinker is going to be torn down. Now, I happen to think Steven Pinker is wrong about some important stuff. Nonetheless, the idea that Steven Pinker is a vile racist who must be torn down is a bit preposterous.
It's totally preposterous.
Right. So the point is, there are statues out there which are truly problematic, to use the vernacular, and there are statues out there that are debatable, and there are statues out there that must stand. And somehow, in the space of a week, we are dealing with tearing down the Steven Pinkers and the George Washingtons. Right. But the point is, it's a never ending game of would you believe, from Get Smart, where the idea is they keep upping the ante of these claims that something is so terrible that it is finally time that we can recognize it and tear it down. And the point is everybody's on the list.
But I mean, I feel like you're making the point of the person with the question and my point as well, which is that if you go back into into history and try to use the morals of today on the historical figures, you will always find them lacking. You will always find modern people lacking as well, but especially the longer in history you go back, the less likely they are to resemble the morals of today, and the easier it's going to be to decide they're not worthy of our respect. And that is a naivete that is patently dangerous.
Right. But the fact is, we fought the Civil War. Listen to me. We fought the Civil War. We fought the Civil War because many people understood that the justifications for slavery were absolutely despicable and unsupportable. And so the point is, memorializing the Confederacy was wrong at the time. It's still wrong. So that does not mean that
I'm not positive of that, but I'll accept.
So anyway, all I'm saying is there is no algorithmic way to do this, right? You try to write the algorithm and there's going to be carnage that is the result of it. And so in light of that, we have to have a good faith discussion about the costs and benefits of various things. And it may be that, the Nazi eagle should have been moved into a museum about despicable things, right? But the tendency to see the symbols of a culture that has transgressed as themselves transgressive and to want to do something about it is a normal human thing. And the problem is that the reaction, which is that all of these things should be preserved because they're simply historical and in their context they were okay, that can't be right. So
I agree.
it's a difficult puzzle. And, we're tearing down George Washington, Steven Pinker, and in the center of Portland, a bonfire was lit under this beautiful statue of an elk, which nobody can make.
Which is now gone. They've taken it down.
They've taken it down.
Yeah.
So they win.
Yep.
They win.
The city of Portland had to take down a 120-something-year-old beautiful statue of an elk because elk are racist. I don't even know. It's impossible.
It's
to
impossible
do
to
the
parse.
math.
It's just incoherent. It's simple destruction. And
Right.
the point is,
so you're going to say, and I think I will agree with you, that even a rubric around decisions about what monuments from the past may have outlived their virtue and utility should not happen at the hands of a violent mob.
never.
Oh, so you do agree with that?
Oh, yeah. I'm not for seeing people pull down public monuments because they've decided
what's the
this.
disagreement then?
The disagreement is whether or not some of these monuments need to come down by some process in which we discuss what it is that they're memorializing.
Okay.
Oh, I'm not advocating. Oh boy, this is the second time this week that people have thought I was ready to pull down monuments.
No, I mean, no, but you are arguing for the fact that some monuments will need to be pulled down, or we'd be better off with some monuments pulled down. I don't think I disagree with you there. I thought that you were actually arguing, and I can actually find some truth in this, that sometimes society might be better off if people who are not in charge of deciding what monuments get to stand and not are the ones who actually say, you know what, I'm done, you're not listening, and I'm going to take it into my own hands. Now, what's happening on the streets is insane and incoherent.
Yep.
But the idea that it always has to be in the hands of the gatekeepers is also not safe.
Well, this is part of my point, is that algorithmically this is very difficult to do, but you have to have a process. It doesn't have to be an algorithmic process, but you have to have a process that at least knows what the objective is, right? So anyway, I'd blow up the Nazi eagle. Sure.
It's already been done.
Yeah. Fair point.
Yes.